This Shabbos is Shabbat HaGadol, and we're going to read in the morning. Can you believe it, huh?
Yeah, sure.
And Shabbos HaGadol, this Shabbos. But that's good because Shabbos is a full week before Pesach. It's not such a bad thing. You can still have chametz this Shabbos, and you don't have to get stressed about it. You know, I don't know. Every year, my wife is worried that we should have chametz on the Shabbos before Pesach. But this year, at least I can reason with her and explain to her that it's a full 7 days. It's a full week before. Up until Motzai Shabbos, I would have said, we have to search for a connection between what's happening in the world in Parshas Vayikra and Parshas Tzav. But this terrible, terrible tragedy that we learned about on Motzai Shabbat that happened in Brooklyn, where 7 children perished in a fire in their home. These were burnt offerings. And that's what the father said at the Levi. He said these were seven pure sheep that were offered as a korban to Hashem. And that's what Vayikra and Tzav are all about, is the laws of the karbanos. You look at the very first pasuk of Parshas Tzav, and it deals with the korban olah, the burnt offering to Hashem, which is considered to be kodesh hakadoshim, the holiest of the offerings. Torah says, Zos Toras ha'olah. Command Aaron and his son, saying, this shall be the law of the olah. Hi ha'olah, it is the burnt offering, al mokedah, that is supposed to be on the burning al hamizbeach kol halayla ad haboker, on the altar, all night until morning. Ve'eish hamizbeach tukad bo, and let the fire of the altar ignite it, completely incinerate it until the morning. And sadly, unfortunately, the Jewish people sometimes themselves have been that korban olah, have been that burnt offering. And it's very, very hard to understand why. It's very hard to understand, to even process the magnitude of the tragedy for one family out of nowhere. And we just pray that the family have a proper nechama, be consoled in some way that is certainly mysterious to us. One of the things that I hope to be able to mention, at least just briefly over Shabbos, is to talk about the importance of fire safety, especially in light of Pesach. Fire safety and carbon monoxide safety, because they do go hand in hand. And especially when you're doing all of this koshering, you have to make sure there's proper ventilation and there's proper fire safety to ensure that no one's going to be adversely affected. And also do your best to make sure that the first thing I did Motzai Shabbos is we made sure to test all of the smoke detectors in the house. You have to, after you read about something like this, make sure you got smoke detectors on every floor of your house, and make sure that the battery is fresh and is still working. Okay, but let's find other connections. It's Shabbos HaGadol, it's the Shabbos before Pesach, and the Kli Yakar has this beautiful interpretation on the very first pasuk of Parshas Tzav. It's a very long commentary, so we'll just extract a few ideas from it. It's the Kli Yakar that you have on your page. He says, Zos Toras ha'olah, hi ha'olah al mokedah. This shall be the law of the olah. It is the olah that is on the fire. So the Kli Yakar points out, hi ha'olah miyutar legamrei. He says those two words, hi ha'olah, it is the olah. Well, of course it's the olah. That's what you're talking about. That's the subject of the sentence. So what do you need to say that for? V'hiskimu hamefarshim lomar shebala hodia shekol ha'osek b'torat ha'olah ki'ilu hikriv olah. It's to tell us that there are two types of olah sacrifices. There's the actual physical animal, the lamb or the cow that is burnt on the altar. And there's also the study of the laws of the olah. And anyone who engages in the study of these laws, of the sacrificial laws, and really internalizes the ideas, is as if he or she had brought their own olah sacrifice. Ve'al zeh amar zot Torah ha'olah. And that's why the Torah begins with the words, this is the Torah of the Olah, meaning, ha'osek v'torat ha'olah, hi ha'olah, zehu tov kemo ha'kravat ha'olah atzma. He says, if you engage in the study of the Olah, you read the Parsha, you study it, and you understand what it means to offer a korban, then it's as if you offered a korban Olah yourself. Let's skip to the next paragraph. He says, V'yesh omrim hi ha'olah. Some say, when it says hi ha'olah, shenechshav lo esek ha'torah, shenikret tushiyah, shemateshet kocho shel adam ki'ilu hikrivhu et atzmo la'olah. Some say that dedicating your life to Torah study, which actually weakens your physical constitution, if you really pour over your studies with great dedication, then it's almost like you're making yourself into a korban olah. It's not like you brought it. It's more than just as if you brought a sacrifice, but as if you made yourself into that very sacrifice. Ve'al tomar she'esek haTorah domeh lahakravat olah al derech ha'avara. He says, and don't think that we're just making a metaphor over here. Shaharei be'emet ein kan lo mokadesh v'lo mizbeach. Because after all, when you study Torah, even you study Torah very diligently and with great self-sacrifice, there's no fire, there's no altar. So what kind of comparison is being made? He says, that's why the pasuk says, Talmud Lomar al mokeda al hamizbeach. That's why the pasuk says, no, your study is like a burning on the altar. Ki eish haTorah asher bikirbo domeh le'eish hamizbeach. Because the fire that is in your gut when you are studying Torah with that passion and with that sense of commitment is like the fire that's on an altar. So he says, realize that when you learn with what we call hit lahavut, which comes from the word lahav or flame, when you study with great passion and great commitment and great diligence, so then there is a fire there is an altar there. V'hodia lanu hakatuv shezman ha'olah kol halayla ad haboker. And he says, notice that the Torah says, when you bring a korban olah, you're supposed to allow the carcass to burn on the altar the entire night. Actually, there's enough firewood to completely char the remains of an entire animal on the altar, but it has to spend the entire night burning, so that by the time the morning comes, the Kohanim come and they clean up the altar. They're just going to find ash. Everything has been carbonized. And so, but that's appropriate for our metaphor as well of a person who commits himself to Torah and mitzvot. Because what does night mean? He says, Shizman ha'olah kol halayla boker va'od she'ad boker miyutar. He says, if it already said, let it burn all night, why does it have to say until morning? Obviously, if it's the entire night, it's until morning. He says, Lilmod dat et ha'am al sad haremez kemo shizman ha'olah kol halayla ha'boker kach hazman hamuchan lazeh sheha'osek b'torat ha'olah domeh ki'ilu hikriv olah hu bizman hagalut shenimshal halayla. He says, just like it's the time of burning this olah sacrifice is at nighttime, so too a great time to dedicate your life to the study of Torah and a commitment to a life of mitzvot is during this darkness, this night of galus, of the diaspora existence. Ki az tzrichim Yisrael l'shalem parim siftotehem. That, after all, is a time when we have no temple. And the only option that we have to dedicate ourselves, to sacrifice ourselves to Hashem, is through the words of our mouths and through our prayers and through our Torah study. Ve'ad haboker v'lo ad bichlal, ki bizman sheya'aleh bokran shel Yisrael, az ya'alu al mizbach Hashem parim mamash. But it says until morning, because morning represents the coming of Mashiach, as we find in a number of references, like when Yaakov wrestled the angel until the morning. That also represents the Messianic age. Because once Mashiach comes and we experience that dawn of Yemos HaMashiach, then we'll go back to offering the actual karbanos. But until then, we can only offer ourselves, and therefore we have to continue burning with that intensity and that passion and that fire throughout the night. I won't go on to the rest of the Kli Yakar, but I wanted to point out something as well. He says, if you take a look at the Haggadah, and we understand now that the whole idea of a burnt offering burning through the night is supposed to act as a lesson that when it's nighttime for the Jewish people, that's when we have to recommit to that fire that burns within us and to make sure that we burn brightly to illuminate the night and to bring light to this diaspora existence. Perhaps we can understand a passage from the HaGadol. It says, Maisa v'Rebbe Eliezer v'Rebbe Yehoshua v'Rebbe Elazar ben Azariah v'Rebbe Akiva v'Rebbe Tarfon. These 5 great sages, Shahayu Mesubin b'Bnei Brak, they were reclining in Bnei Brak. Now, when was this? Historically, when was this? Well, we know that these sages lived in the generation after the Churban, in the generation after the destruction of the temple. And this is very important, this historical backdrop, because I think it is directly related to this idea of letting the fire burn at night. And yet, despite the fact that they're living in the generation after the Churban, they are able to still muster the strength and the excitement and the passion to be able to relate the story of the Exodus the entire night. It's almost like you just imagine by frame of reference the Jews who came out of Auschwitz or Bergen-Belsen or any of the other camps, that very first Pesach, or the first few years afterwards, celebrating a Pesach to celebrate liberation. But liberation from what? My whole family has been killed. I'm the only survivor. And so what am I celebrating? And yet, you find that these sages still had this ability to keep that fire within them burning, that fire of excitement and love and passion and commitment, despite the suffering and the carnage and destruction that they had been witness to. Ad shabo talmidehem v'amru lahem, until their students came to them and told them, Rabboseinu higi zman kriya shema shel shacharis, our masters, the time of reciting the Shema has arrived. Do you see a parallel to this idea of keeping the fire burning until the morning? This is exactly what they're doing in a very, very literal sense. They're keeping that fire of passion and excitement alive throughout the night of Pesach until the morning, which is Ad HaBoker, until the morning which represents Yemos HaMashiach. And that's why immediately after that passage in the Haggadah, you have the next line of the Haggadah that says, Amar Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah says, Harei ani kiven shivim shana. I'm like a 70-year-old man. I've been around the block a few times. V'lo zachisi shetei amar yetzias Mitzrayim ba'leilos ad shedarasha ben zoma. And I never had the privilege to being able to derive homiletically how we know that a person should relate the Exodus at night. Now, of course, what this means is something completely different if you look at the original context of Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah's statement. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah was not really talking about having a Pesach Seder. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, in the context of when he made the statement, was talking about how you know that you're supposed to recite the 3rd paragraph of Shema every night, which mentions the story of the Exodus, right? The part we call the Parshas Hatzitzis, which says, Ani Hashem Elokeichem asher hotzeisi eschem me'eretz Mitzrayim, that I am the Lord your God who took you out of Egypt. But the reason why it's placed here in the Haggadah is because what Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah is reflecting upon is that there's an attitudinal enlightenment that I've experienced by listening to Ben Zoma and understanding from him that despite the fact that there may not be that much to celebrate about being Jewish at very, very dark periods in Jewish history, a Jew can still find the excitement of just being alive as a Jew and being able to have this very, very intimate relationship with the Ribono Shel Olam, despite the darkness that is all around him or her. And that's what Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah is being used for. He's saying right after we read this story about these 5 sages who were reclining in Bnei Brak, and we see from their example how they were able to find this excitement to relate the Exodus throughout the dark night of Golus, the Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah is now saying that this is also my lesson that I learned from Ben Zoma. That I learned from him this idea that it is possible to relate the Exodus and to have this sense of liberation and leaving Egypt and becoming free and going to a glorious future, even when the present is mired in tremendous darkness and pain and suffering. So that's, I think, a very, very important lesson that connects Parshas Tzav with the whole story of Shabbos HaGadol and Pesach. But I think it goes more than. I just want to make one more observation, and then I'll let you go. If you go back to the pasuk that we started with, which is pasuk Beis in the parsha, the Torah says, "Tzav Aaron ve'espanav leimor," command Aaron and his children, saying, "Zot Torah ha'olah." This is the law of the Olah. He ha'olah. It is, after all, the Olah sacrifice al mokedah, that should be in a state of burning, or on the pyre that is burning, that is on top of the mizbeach. Now, notice that there's something unusual about the word mokedah.
The mem is small.
The mem is small. Now, that's not just the printing error on your sheet. That's the way it actually appears in the Sefer Torah. The mem is written small. And the question is, why is the mem written small? So the Kotzker was quoted as saying that the reason why the mem is small is because since we're describing the passion, the burning fire that is within the belly of every single Jew when he's serving Hashem, even during the nighttime, a Jew has to remember that despite the fact that I'm passionate and excited about my Yiddishkeit, I have to be humble about it as well. There's a humility that a Jew has to have even amidst his passion and excitement about Yiddishkeit. You can't start jumping on the world stage and saying how proud you are to be a Jew and doing it in an immodest fashion. You have to serve Hashem with modesty at the same time that you're passionate and excited about it. That's one way of explaining it. But allow me to suggest another explanation. We just learned in this last week's parsha, Vayikra el Moshe, that God called out to Moshe. Now, if you notice, what's unusual about the word Vayikra? A small letter aleph. So it's the very beginning of this last week's parsha. Vayikra is a small letter aleph. And in this coming week's parsha, there's a small letter mem. Now, Rashi told us something very interesting. In Vayikra, he says, you know why the aleph is small? So Rashi says, and I didn't even bother to print the Rashi for you here, is because Moshe Rabbeinu made the aleph small because really the word he wanted to read was Vayikar. That God came upon Moshe in a happenstance fashion and a haphazard fashion that was not planned. Moshe wanted to minimize his own importance. It's not that he deserved to be visited by God. He himself was a small man, and therefore he felt uncomfortable writing Vayikra, which would imply a greatness to Moshe, that God calls out to Moshe. So instead, he wanted it to read Vayikar without the aleph. So that tells me that when the aleph appears small in the Torah, it means that it could also be read without the aleph there. So that's my cue, that the word mokedah could also be read without the letter mem, because the letter mem is small. There's only one place in the entire Tanakh where you have the word Vav Kuf Dalid Hey, which, what do you think that means? First of all, where does that word appear? I have it for you here. It's in Parshas Ki Tisa, which I read just a few weeks ago. Vikida. Vikida. What does Vikida mean? What is Kida? Anyone know?
It says here.
Rashi has it over here. Shem Shorish Esav. It's a certain kind of herb that was used in the manufacturing of the incense. So, Uvalashim Chachamim Kitzia. The rabbis call it Kitzia. Mor uKitzia are two different kinds of aromatic spices or herbs. You know, Kitzia is known, some call it's in English, they translate it as cassia. I don't know if anyone's ever heard of that. It's a certain species of cinnamon. It's very aromatic. But whatever it is, we know one thing is true about Kitzia, which is another word for kida, is that it has a beautiful smell, has a beautiful fragrance. So much so that the Talmud tells us in Bava Batra that Eov had 3 daughters. The famous Job. He had 3 daughters. One daughter's name was Kitsia. So the Talmud asks, why did he call his middle daughter Kitsia? The Talmud answers, Shahaya Recha Nodev Kitsia, because she had such a beautiful fragrance about her. If she walked by you, you'd say, ah, what a beautiful fragrance this girl emits. The point is that Eov's daughters were very, very special. They were beautiful. They smelled very, very lovely. They just were all around just wonderful girls. That's why he called the one daughter Yamima. Another daughter was called Kitsia. The third daughter was called Keren Hafuch. All of these names imply a beauty, an inherent beauty within the daughters of Eov, which is why it was so tragic when his whole family was taken away from him. But the point, perhaps, is that what our sages are alluding to when they make the mem small is that the sweetest fragrance for Hashem is the fragrance of the Jewish people burning through the night. It's a great sacrifice. It's an ola. It's a burnt offering. But at the end of the day, the passion that a Jew displays through his Torah and mitzvahs, and especially when one does it at night, is the sweetest possible fragrance. It's only mentioned as an allusion because it's very, very difficult to be able to create that level of passion so much that it is the most fragrant thing for Hashem to smell. But indeed, the fragrance of a Jew in Galus, who remains faithful, who remains committed despite the adversity, despite the challenges all around him, despite all of the distractions and all of the temptations and all of the things that would want to pull you away from that life of Torah, that's the most fragrant thing that you can possibly offer to Hashem. So that's why I think that the word mokedah doesn't just mean something that's burning, but it means that when something is burning, it's like kidah. It's like that aromatic cinnamon before Hashem. And we should all remember this, is that no korban that is brought to Hashem, no sacrifice that is made for Hashem in the Galus goes unnoticed, goes unseen. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is mindful of it all. And even though we can't necessarily understand why sometimes these very, very tragic events occur, we should bear in mind that they are l'reach nichoach, that they create a very fragrant aroma before Hashem, and that in the end we'll be able to understand how this fits into the larger frame of Jewish history and how everything was for a purpose.